Good day, students. So, with regards to the next theme, that is theme 10 within your subject guide and obviously within VBS 206 then, it is called bush encroachment. So, hopefully I would be able to cover all of the theme within this type of video format, but obviously we will go and discuss it once we get back into class next week as well. There's quite a few things that we need to go and take account of with regards to what we should cover, and that is content. So if you go and look in your study guide underneath theme 10, bush encroachment and control, you would see that there's a bunch of outcomes, and we've got a specific set of notes. Then we've got van Oudtshoorn Appendix B, and then also pages 81 to 86 and 167 to 176. So in other words, all of these, that is sources or resources rather, needs to complement one another to give you a better overall definition and explanation of what bush encroachment and the control thereof actually are. So theme 11, we're going to look at the control of alien invasive plants. Now it is bush encroachment and the control thereof. I mean, everything is within the word bush encroachment, isn't it? So the big question is, what is bush encroachment other than the encroachment or the thickening of, let's say, the woody component? So if we think encroachment and bush, we do not think of grasses necessarily. We think of, well, shrubs, and we think of trees, and maybe dwarf shrubs as well, that densifies within an area, as opposed to the other component within the veld, that is the stratum of the grasses and therefore, let's say, all of the herbaceous plants. So the forbs and the grasses basically, and the restioids we can also rather say are herbaceous and not woody. So bush encroachment focuses in on the encroachment or the densification of bush, and that is the shrubs and the trees. Now there's a specific video that I also want you guys to go and watch if you have time. It gives you a nice indication of examples, and in this case it would be the encroachment of savannas with trees and shrubs. Now I've put the link within the presentation that's available on CA Connect. There you would see the link. It's on slide 5. It's bush encroachment, or you can obviously just quickly go and Google the thickening of savannas with trees and shrubs. It's a SEANCE seminar. It was done January 2021. So it's about 45 minutes long, but it gives you a nice indication of bush encroachment, the drivers of bush encroachment, the definition of bush encroachment, therefore the causes of bush encroachment, and some necessities with regards to the ecology of the whole situation within an environment surrounding bush encroachment, what influences it have, and how basically to try and control it. So go and watch this video. It will give you some nice information to conceptualize the idea of bush encroachment. So obviously it's quite an important aspect within the veld, and that is to take an account of bush encroachment and the prevalence thereof. Obviously bush encroachment in Afrikaans is bosverdigting. You can obviously follow within the notes. You'll see that there's a bit of on the presentations, you'll see that there's a bit of Afrikaans as well. So the majority of the work is in Afrikaans, but then there's little excerpts like this little graph that you see over here. Unfortunately, that's only in English, and pieces that I took out of a specific article or paper that's also just in English. But I mean, to get just the terminology behind you in Afrikaans, please go and read obviously the Afrikaans notes, the Afrikaans sections within van Oudtshoorn, and you would be able to understand those pieces that I'm going to go through as well. So firstly, I'm quickly going to focus on what the theme, and that is the notes of theme 10 basically says. So you've got CA notes, and what does that basically say? And then we've got some case studies and examples that comes into play as well. So what is bush encroachment? Bush encroachment is a natural phenomenon that results in the transformation of a grass-dominated ecosystem to a tree-dominated ecosystem through a process known as plant succession. Unmanaged grasslands become colonized by hardy pioneer tree species. Shade produced by the canopy of these trees rapidly begin to stunt and kill the natural grass-dominated ground cover. The shaded area then becomes colonized by shade-loving shrubs and forms an ideal place for other tree species to germinate. Over time, a small forest clump begins to develop, and we have to take note, as we go through this, it focuses in on a lot of, let's say, savanna and grassland and maybe to a certain extent some Indian Ocean coastal belt, maybe some thicket biomes as well. But bush encroachment can obviously occur in fynbos. So whenever you see it is grasses being transformed to trees, I mean, it can be fynbos transformed obviously to the densification of a habitat that is now basically trees and shrubs instead of our normal renosterveld shrub or fynbos shrub. Over time, a small forest clump begins to develop around the original tree. Often the invasive shrubs such as kakiweed, lantana, and triffidweed beginning to emerge on the outskirts of the clump. As more of these clumps begin to develop, there is a conversion from grass-dominated veld to a woody veld type. So that's actually quite a good definition. This is more specific, and the article that we are now reading from comes from the KZN area. So Natal, where you've mostly got grasslands on the high veld, and then obviously it goes into more type of savanna and almost tropical dense areas such as your Indian Ocean coastal belt as you obviously get closer to the coastline. So when we talk about lantana and kaki and triffid, then we always think of KZN basically. So I mean, that is just an example of, but take into account the definition of bush encroachment. So above left, woody clumps emerging in natural grasslands. So these little woody clumps that you can see over there. Then you've got above young acacias encroaching into grassland. So all over the place within this grassland, you've got little small dwarf shrubs and shrubs, usually little single-stemmed. In this case now, yes, they still say acacias, but it's basically Vachilias and Senegalias that's popping up all over the place. And if you leave this as it is now and just leave it to grow, then obviously within 5, 6, 7 years, maybe 10 years, you've got a massive, densified, large stand trees within what was once a natural, maybe grassland. So what does that then do? It reduces the amount of grasses and increases the amount of woody species. What does that do to your stocking capabilities? I mean, and the structures for stocking. Obviously now you are taking away grasses, so reduction of the grazers on the property. It increases the woody component, so an increase in the browser component on the community. Now we do have to remember in an instance like this, if all of a sudden it encroaches to such an extent that accessibility becomes a problem, then we cannot always say that more trees on a property is necessarily a good thing, because that's not the case. The more trees and the more dense the trees are actually growing on a property, the less accessible it's actually to those animals that need to utilize it. So look at this clump as an example. I mean, if you now go and try and see whether there's animals that actually utilize this clump, yes, they would utilize this clump mainly on the outside of this bush clump now. They would rarely go and try and penetrate this clump. Now it's exactly the same. I mean, say this clump is now a couple of hectares or tens of hectares or hundreds of hectares large, then still the animals are most probably just going to feed on the outskirts basically of this massive clump because it's highly inaccessible to get to the interior of this. So it does not necessarily all of a sudden say now you've got more woody species, more browse availability, so we can increase the amount of browsers. That's not the case. Artificial control still needs to ensue. You cannot just put on more browsers always. Even though that is a solution to put on more browsers, you still have to do it with keeping the specifics of accessibility in mind. Okay, so here you can see some people cutting down branches, maybe stacking it as well. So think back to when we were at Van Scoorsdrift and we cut down those alien invasives. That was mainly Port Jackson willow. Now think if those willows were now an indigenous species, then we would refer to it as the encroachment of indigenous species. So it would be bush encroachment. It would not be encroachment by alien invasives, which was in this case the problem, but if it's indigenous, it's just bush encroachment. So if you can see this differentiation between these two farms as well. So here you've got that fence line. We call this the fence line effect of two different types of management styles or inputs that is basically ensuring the type of outcome that you see within the habitat. So over here, they are most probably using fire to burn this area, to control or to burn off little saplings of possible encroaching species. So like we saw earlier with those Vachilias and Senegalias or the Digrostachus, the sickle bush popping up all over the place. You've got Swartak, that's a massive problem in the Karoo and the Kalahari area. Digrostachus, obviously sickle bush being a massive problem in Limpopo, Mpumalanga, KZN. Here in the Western Cape, obviously it now depends whether you're on the coastal area, Mediterranean area, down to the south coast, or whether you're inland into the Karoo. Like I said, Swartak is maybe a problem within the Karoo, some Grevias as well. On the coastal areas, you would find that something like the dwars skers bos might be a problem in some type of strandveld fynbos, and it's very diverse at the end of the day when we get to the fynbos and what type of species might be encroaching. So we'll look at a couple of species if time allows for it later on as well. So this is called the fence line effect. Be able to discuss this as well. Different management styles lead to different outcomes. This is what happens maybe if you do not stock properly, if you do not burn properly. You ensure that the woody component develops on the property as well, because now there's also stress maybe put on the grassy layer. But it's not always the case. I mean, if we go to this specific figure, where's that figure now? This one, we can see the causes of bush encroachment being fire. So what does that mean? So if you continuously put too much pressure on the grassy layer through the use of fire, and then all of a sudden you leave it for a while, then you might find that the woody component takes over, because now there's more pressure on the grasses, less pressure maybe on the woody component, and other factors such as an increase, you can see the increase in CO2. So with regards to climate change and the increase in greenhouse gases, this usually benefits the woody component more so than the grassy component. So if you've got an area that has got increased levels of carbon dioxide within the atmosphere, then that specific component is going to increase the growth of the woody component over the grassy component. But the fire suppression can obviously cause, to a certain extent, also the densification of the woody component. I mean, if you just keep fire out of a system that is well, that basically needs fire, then obviously you're going to have a situation where the grassy layer is going to become diseased or moribund, is what we call it. And that specific scenario places pressure on the grassy component, and obviously it then would benefit the woody component. Herbivory as well, so too many herbivores that feeds on, let's say, the grassy component puts pressure on the grasses, and therefore more grazers. In other words, it puts pressure on the grass component, and therefore it increases the probability of woody species growing and proliferating within an area. Then again, if you've got too many browser stock, what would then happen? Usually the opposite. So then they place a lot of pressure on the woody component, and now grasses proliferate within an area. That's obviously not called bush encroachment, but still it is a problem. So basically what you need to see is that there needs to be an exact balance between these two stratums, and that is herbaceous and woody. And it is really dependent on the type of habitat as well. If you've got a biome of grassland, a grassland biome, then obviously you know that maybe there should be a specific ratio of grasses to woody species. And to make the grassland biome just a good example of a savanna habitat, that's usually not the best thing if you tend to look at the production and obviously conservation efforts within an area. Bush encroachment is considered to be one of the most extensive forms of degradation in rangelands in arid and semi-arid regions of the earth. And that's obviously where we are at. We are at semi-arid, and that is now the majority of South Africa. We can be classified between arid and semi-arid, obviously arid being up towards the Namibian side, semi-arid, the Karoo, even the Savannah, etc. With arid and semi-arid areas covering about a quarter of the land surface of the earth, between 50 and 80% of these areas being used as rangelands, and more than 1 billion people earning their livelihood directly from livestock farming in these areas. Bush encroachment is a major worldwide problem. So obviously it reduces the production potential of certain rangelands, especially if you look at the grazing component thereof. So within a paper of O'Connor, encroachment was most rapid on small protected areas. Encroachment was most rapid on small protected areas, intermediate under commercial tenure, and slowest under communal tenure and large natural environments with mega herbivores present. So why mega herbivores are usually those ecosystem engineers that puts a lot of pressure on the bush component or the woody component within an ecosystem. So if you've got them present, then usually they do tend to control the encroachment of the woody component. Several drivers of bush encroachment which interact and change over time have been proposed. Fires, for example, were actively suppressed during the early 20th century. However, rainfall interacts with fire, and the rate of woody increase under fire exclusion is linearly related to mean annual rainfall. A reduction in browsing herbivores from the 19th century would have had a positive cumulative effect on woody cover, whilst an increase in grazing herbivores would have reduced the competitive effect of grasses. So we spoke about this earlier. Encroachment was most rapid during the high rainfall mid-1970s, which followed the 1960s drought, when cattle numbers were at their peak and the grass layer was degraded. Increasing atmospheric CO2 and climate change has emerged as important drivers in the recent literature. Bush encroachment depends on the interplay of history, environment management, and vegetation, and the recognition of which is essential for containing encroachment. In the absence of disturbances such as fire and herbivores that limit the woody component, the savanna will thicken if the rainfall allows it, until it is counteracted by competition between the trees for space. Obviously, once the trees grow to such an extent or densifies to such an extent within an area, they would then not necessarily compete with the grassy layer anymore, but they actually do compete with one another. And that is why you've got these thickets, these encroached thickets, almost forest-type habitats forming, which has got now a defined, like a subcanopy and a canopy and a basal layers of growth, basically. So what is the difference between bush encroachment and invasive alien plant infestation? The key difference between bush encroachment and invasive alien plant infestations is nou bosverdigting en uitheemse plantindringing, is that bush encroachers are mainly indigenous woody plants. Another important difference is that under certain circumstances, these indigenous woody plants have important ecological niches, specific places within an ecosystem to fill, such as in natural forest, along watercourses or ravines, or other wooded ecosystems like ravines. Invasive alien plants have no natural niche in South Africa and should be eradicated. Okay, so I'm going to read through the causes of bush encroachment. This is usually a very popular question in a paper somewhere, is what is the causes, and there's an array of them. You can find causes of bush encroachment in Van Oudtshoorn in your notes, as well as on this presentation, as well as the video that you would go and watch as well. So take note of all of them, see where there's overlapping, and then obviously clarify on a set that is not repetitive. So make yourself a list, basically. Natural ecosystems are maintained by a number of natural conditions known as limiting factors. These may be specific climatic conditions such as rainfall or temperature, soil conditions such as nutrients and pH, or physical factors such as fire or grazing. For example, the type of vegetation found in the arid Karoo region will retain its characteristics because the low rainfall of the vegetation does not favor more temperate or tropical vegetation. This is just the basics of successive ecology that we've done now over the last 2 years. Climate is the main limiting factor in maintaining Karoo ecosystems. Within the eThekwini municipality area, the main limiting factor of our 2 grass-dominated veld types is that KwaZulu-Natal Sandstone Sauerveld and Ngongoni veld are fire and grazing. This is why our grasslands are sometimes referred to as fire climax grasslands. As our grass-dominated ecosystem are reduced through urban development and agricultural uses, they often end up as small islands where grazing and fire are reduced or done away with completely. Our climate favors natural succession from a grass-dominated ecosystem to a more wooded one, resulting in grasslands becoming woodier if not properly managed. Is bush encroachment a problem? Yes, within the specific area, it is a problem. Our diverse grasslands are prone to bush encroachment, which reduces their biodiversity further. So, pause this video if you want to and quickly go and read through those facts. It gives some statistics on why it is actually a problem within that, what they call the EMA area of KZN. There's some species within KwaZulu-Natal. Over there on the picture you see brackenfern. Brackenfern is actually a problem within the Western Cape as well. But there's climbing flatbeam, coast silver oak, false asagaiwood, flat crown, Matseri. Please do know quite a few of these invasive species within specific biomes as well. That is usually a question. So go and take each biome and write down at least 2 or 3 or 4 species, learn their species name as well. If you go to page 84 within Van Oudtshoorn, they've got numerous species over there as well. The majority of these are invasive species within the grasslands and then savanna areas. There you've got flamethorn, sweet thorn, umbrella thorn, black thorn, sickle bush, blue bush, velvet raisin on page 86, oldwood, silver cluster leaf, bankrupt bush, mopani, and blue thorn. Whilst we're on Van Oudtshoorn, if you page to page 81, you would see that there's a nice indication of a fixed point photography monitoring that has taken place now. It seems like it's somewhere near Queenstown in the Eastern Cape, where there's a photo taken in 1925, and it's quite an open area with sparse placement of what seems to be some trees, some aloes on the side here, and some cycads. And then all of a sudden, 1993, there's an encroachment, and then in 2012, you can rarely see these grasslands that was so prolific in 1925. That's a good indication of how encroachment now morphs basically, or transforms the structure and physical appearance of a habitat. The causes of bush encroachment on page 82 in Van Oudtshoorn. Species selective overgrazing of palatable forage plants. So please follow with me in your book. Species selective overgrazing of palatable forage plants, thereby weakening such plants to the benefit of encroaching species, which are generally less preferable to grazers. Species selective overgrazing was uncommon in the past because there were no restricting barriers such as fences and predators preventing animals from remaining in one area for too long. Here again now, species selective overgrazing, we're talking about the removal of the mega herbivores out of small conservation areas and what impact that can have. The lack of fire damage to young woody plants. So a rule of thumb usually is if you've got a stand of small woody plants now starting to encroach, like we saw with the Vachilias and Senegalias, where was that? This picture over here. The use of fire within that area can benefit the area. And yet again, now you have to look at the frequency so that you do not put too much pressure on the grassy component, because too frequent fires on the grassy component can have exact opposite effect of all of a sudden now you're killing off and putting pressure on the grassy component, so the woody species is taking over. But if it's used intermittently and at correct phases basically, then usually it's maybe once every 2 or 3 or 4 years. Then if you burn, the rule of thumb, like I said, is all saplings, the majority of saplings, the overwhelming majority of saplings, 70, 80, 90% almost of saplings in this area, depending on the type of burn, usually quite hot burn, would kill off those saplings now that is below 1.5 meter. So if you burn this area, I mean, you can now see that the grass is short, it's still green. Are these trees already dead? I do not know, most probably not. There's some foliage on this tree, not on these yet. But I mean, it depends now really on the species. But I mean, to go and burn a hot fire throughout this environment now is going to be impossible. You have to wait until it's the right time now to burn, when these trees actually have enough, let's say, material to burn as well. Okay, let's continue with the causes of bush encroachment in page 82. So the lack of browsers, a big problem. The lack of trampling damage on woody plants, that's a new one. So if you've got a lot of larger herbivores that's trampling within an area, they usually trample small saplings into the ground, and obviously reducing the growth of, or the probability of encroachment of the woody component. So the lack of trampling damage. Increased carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, woody species are better adapted. We've discussed this. Disturbance of natural vegetation structure. So when the natural vegetation structure is disturbed by the removal of larger trees, for example, more seedlings emerge to compete for new vacant space. Then the loss of soil fertility. In many cases, bush encroachment coincides with the loss of soil fertility and organic soil content either through sheet erosion or through tilling. Obviously, these woody species would be better adapted to a situation where soil erosion has occurred, as they can penetrate deeper and have more expansive area to look for nutrients basically within the topsoil, if there are any. They can also tap into deeper levels of soil moisture or water. So in other words, just better in general in an environment where erosion occurs, as opposed to then obviously the grassy layer. Change in rainfall intensity. When runoff rates are high, woody plants with a deeper root systems can better absorb moisture from deep down than grasses. So very similar to what we've discussed. There you can see a fence line effect in figure 3.20 on page 82 as well. So some more now on the slides. Poor veld management, where the grasses are overutilized and which does not receive enough rest. Drought and insect plagues can further weaken the herbaceous layer, together with overgrazing, which again reduces the appearance of fire, favoring the woody species. The herbaceous layer, obviously die kruidagtige laag in Afrikaans, teenoor die houtagtige laag. Misuse of fire, the total absence of fire, the absence of browsers, the absence of migration patterns that leads to patch overgrazing, the absence of elephants and porcupines, so those ecosystem engineers that might ringbark the trees, naturally ringbark the trees and kill off some of the trees. The elephants obviously not only ringbarking but pushing over the trees and killing them. The incorrect placement of water holes, human activities, seed dispersal of woody species by herbivores. Okay, so that's a bunch of more causes, oorsake. Okay, so what's the consequences of bush encroachment? It leads to the increase in woody plant species, obviously, and a decrease in grass density and production, and reduces the ecological grazing capacity of the veld. Especially now with regards to firstly the graze, and then like we discussed earlier, then the browse essentially as well. Well, eventually as well. Surface water drainage and soil erosion also worsen. The Vachelia and Senegalias thicken. Malopo area in northwest reduced the ecological grazing capacity from 8 hectares per large animal unit to 46 hectares per large animal unit over a few decades. That is tremendous, don't you think? It's a good example then of the resultant effect of bush encroachment. The annual production of grass in the arid and semi-arid savannas decreased by 40% due to the thickening of species such as the Vachelia and Senegalia and the rhigosums, and then also Stibia vulgaris. The leaf, stem, apexes, and fruit of woody species that are defended are good quality food for browsers, but the monostand effect of bush thickening actually results in a decrease in browser capacity. Yet again, we've discussed that as well. Okay, so I think that does it for the definition of what bush encroachment is, of what are the causes and then the effects of bush encroachment. And then we've looked at some species as well. We've looked at some examples. And we've touched on the monitoring of through using maybe fixed point photography to give us an indication. So I'm going to stop this specific video now and then continue with the assessment of bush encroachment, veld for bush encroachment, and then the control of bush encroachment as well. Okay, so there would then be a second part to this video.